As ancient as this passage is, it seems to me to be just the right passage. It seems like a very, very fresh passage for our times. Earlier this week, I got a text from my sister-in-law, and it simply said, "We are overwhelmed. No time to enjoy life." The day after that, I got a text from a colleague of mine at CST, and she wanted to tell me about a dream that she'd had. She said, "Last night I had a dream. I was underwater and trying to fight my way to the surface, but there was just so much ocean." How many of us are still breathing, still dutifully swimming, but never somehow finding our way to the surface? There's this moment I remember really vividly, walking down the street in a little Oregon town with my hands in my pockets. I became aware in that moment that something was so different about me, but I didn't quite know what it was. I had my hands in my pockets. I wasn't speaking. I was just a body enjoying the morning sun. This was a moment of rest. Why to this day would I remember one morning of slow walking? Well, because most of the time I'm busy making bricks, and you're busy making bricks. That's what the Hebrew slaves were doing in Egypt. They made bricks for Pharaoh, bricks for his storehouses. The richer Pharaoh got off their slavery, the more storehouses he needed for his grain, the harder they had to work making bricks. Pharaoh ran a brutal economic regime, and there was no room for protest. He was both ruler and god of the Egyptians. Pharaoh worked the slaves harder and harder until he eventually decreed that they had to provide their own straw for the bricks, and that straw had to be gathered on their own time. Their whole lives were taken over by the Egyptian god's production schedule. And then our God rescued them and gave them the Ten Commandments. What the Ten Commandments really are is part of an unfolding story. In fact, they mark the end of one story and the beginning of another story for the Hebrews. Before Sinai, the Hebrews were slaves to a God who treated them like they were mere machines for producing wealth. Every day was the same. Gather straw, make bricks. Gather straw, make bricks. There was no alternative. And then all of a sudden, at Sinai, their slave story has ended, and a new alternative story has begun. So what is their new story? Well, in Exodus 20, we don't know. It's still unfolding. The Ten Commandments are the exposition of Israel's new story. God says to a weary but still hopeful people, "You're mine now." But who is God? Who are the Israelites? Who are we? God uses the first three of the commandments to define God's character. In the first commandment, God essentially says, "I am not Pharaoh. With me you are safe from other gods who would exploit you and oppress you for their own gain. I am more powerful than any other god. Worshipping me frees you from oppression." Then in the second commandment, God says, "You must not turn me into an object. Do not domesticate me. Do not commodify me and thus tempt yourselves to use my power as your own." In the third commandment, God again warns against domesticating the divine. "My name is not a casual thing you can throw around," God says. It is not yours to use however you want, to praise or to damn, whatever you deem worthy or unworthy. Be very careful about co-opting the power of my name for your own interests. Then in the fourth commandment, God shifts course. God starts to define the character of these new Israelites. You are not machines built to produce wealth, God says. You are no longer brick people. You are Sabbath people. You are, like your God, creators. 6 days you will work, but the seventh day will be different. Like your God, you will rest. This must have sounded like paradise to these former slaves. Under Pharaoh, there was no diversity in their days. Every day was the same. Gather straw, make bricks. Gather straw, make bricks. And now here was God and his Sabbath, recognizing that they are human, that they have bodies that get tired and spirits that need refreshment. But then again, maybe that is not the essence of Sabbath at all. After all, in Genesis, we learn that once God had created the heavens and the earth, God rested from all the work. So perhaps what the Sabbath commandment recognizes is not so much our humanity, but our kinship with God. We were made in the image of a God who rests. We share the divine quality of needing rest. So then what is the Sabbath? What is the purpose of it? Is it to remind us of our humanity? Or is it to remind us of our kinship with God? Yes. The answer is yes. The answer is that the Sabbath is a recognition of our identity as created beings. As created beings, we are different from God, our Creator. We are God's works of art. And as created beings, we have that of God in us. Just like every work of art has that of its creator within it. But still, why is this important, this distinction? Why is it important to point out that the Sabbath commandment addresses us as both human and like God? I think it's important because we forget how complex we are. We forget we are both human and of God. We simplify our identities and our needs because there's straw to be gathered before daylight falls. And all we want to do is get a little bit of rest. It is important to remember that Sabbath is not just a practice. Sabbath is part of our identity as Christians. This weekly church service celebrates the covenant made all those years ago at Sinai. And yet, beyond those doors, on Monday morning, there are a whole lot of pharaohs sneaking around, trying to grab more of our time. Some of them are our bosses. Some of them are our own egos. But it's a lot more fun to pick on our bosses, so let's start there. I had a boss once who intimidated us with yelling and red-faced anger. He loved to belittle our work. He was a real gather straw on your own time kind of guy. But I don't think he was unusual. Our fast consumer economy is full of pharaohs that threaten our Sabbath identity. They threaten to make us machines, mere producers of wealth. We work so much and have so much anxiety about work when we are not technically working that we don't have the leisure to remember why we do it all in the first place. Sabbath reminds us that we are more than our time cards and our 401ks. We are more than our failures or successes at work. We belong to God, not to the company, not to the economy, not to the GDP, not to the Protestant work ethic. Honoring God's day reminds us that though we may sell our labor and our talents to the corporation, we have that in us that can never, ever be bartered away. We have that of God in us. We can't put all the blame on the pharaohs of the fast economy. The pharaohs of our own ego bear some responsibility as well. Work feeds our desire to be needed, to be recognized, to feel powerful. Who could possibly get enough of that? Work might make us feel a deep sense of satisfaction, might make us feel successful, irreplaceable, loved, creative. Without the practice of Sabbath, we begin to feel like we are in control. And as nice as that might sound, it actually only adds to our anxiety. Without rest to acknowledge God and creation, we push God out of the picture. Sabbath is an opportunity to dethrone the pharaohs of our ego from the center of our world and make room for God. The rest and reflection of Sabbath return us to our full identity as God's people. We are both human and of God. July 4th happens to be my twin niece's birthday. They turned 12 this year. However, I needed to finish this sermon, and I had a paper to write, and I had a bunch of reading to do to prepare for an intensive class that begins in about 2 hours. So, I told my brother that I could only come to their party for a couple of hours. As my family celebrated, I spent the morning and into the afternoon writing and not responding to a bunch of texts that were coming in, like, heard at a popular LA gathering place, I wish Auntie Luli was here. Another one read, just so you know, there has been a countdown since about 10 a.m. this morning. It's 3 hours until Auntie Luli gets here. It's 2 hours until Auntie Luli gets here. It's only 1 more hour until Auntie Luli gets here. After ignoring the texts for a while, I looked up from my work and snarkily responded, I suppose this has nothing to do with the fact that when Auntie Luli gets there, the girls can finally open their birthday gifts. And my brother wrote back, no, it's because to them, you are a total rock star. I just hung my head. What a jerk. No matter how many sermons I write, no matter what I do to get ahead, work will never make me a rock star. I will only ever achieve that by being Auntie Luli, which is who I am when no one's paying me. Of all the things that I need to invest my time in, that's the one with the biggest return. Auntie Luli is Sabbath people. Auntie Luli is a Sabbath rock star. How good is that? That's gospel good. That's Jesus saying, come to me,